He watched his greatest enemy drowning in the Pacific Ocean. One order and the war would be easier. One decision and thousands of his own men would be saved. But what General George Kenney did next shocked everyone, and the reason why reveals the kind of warrior America had forgotten. March 1943. The Bismarck Sea north of New Guinea. American planes are destroying a Japanese convoy. Thousands of Japanese soldiers are in the water, drowning, clinging to wreckage. General George Kenney is in command of the air operation. His pilots are asking for permission to strafe the men in the water. To machine gun them while they're helpless. It would be easy. It would be effective. And it would be a war crime. This is the story of the general who proved you could fight with honor even in the most brutal war in history. George Kenney wasn't supposed to be important. He wasn't West Point. He didn't come from a military family. He was just a guy from Canada who moved to Massachusetts as a kid and decided to join the army. Born in 1889, Kenney grew up in a world that was changing fast. Automobiles were replacing horses. Electricity was spreading. And most importantly for Kenney's future, airplanes were being invented. The Wright brothers made their first flight when Kenney was 14 years old. By the time he was in his 20s, aviation was becoming a real thing, not just a crazy experiment. Kenney joined the Army in 1917 when America entered World War I. He wanted to be a pilot. Flying was the exciting new branch of the military. Kenney learned to fly and was sent to France. He flew combat missions over the Western Front. He shot down 2 German planes and earned medals for bravery. But more importantly, he learned how air power could be used in war. After World War I, Kenney stayed in the Army. He became one of the air power advocates. The guys who believed that airplanes would change warfare completely. That future wars would be won or lost in the air. Most senior generals thought these air power guys were crazy. They thought airplanes were just support weapons. Useful for reconnaissance maybe. But the real fighting would always be done by infantry and artillery. Kenney spent the 1920s and 1930s arguing for air power. Writing papers. Giving presentations. Designing new tactics. He wasn't making many friends among the traditional army leadership. They thought he was arrogant and too aggressive in pushing his ideas. Kenney didn't care. He knew he was right. When World War II started, Kenney was a brigadier general. Not high-ranking. Not well-connected. Just a guy with ideas about how to use airplanes in combat. In 1942, he was assigned to command the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific. Under General Douglas MacArthur. This assignment could have been a disaster. MacArthur was famously difficult to work with. He had a huge ego. He demanded absolute loyalty. He fired officers who disagreed with him. And he didn't know much about air power or care to learn. MacArthur thought in terms of ground campaigns. Taking territory. Capturing objectives. Air power was just something that supported his ground operations. Kenney could have tried to work around MacArthur. Or tried to fight with him for control. Instead, Kenney did something smart. He made himself useful. He showed MacArthur what air power could do. He delivered results. And gradually, MacArthur came to trust him and give him freedom to operate. When Kenney arrived in the Southwest Pacific in July 1942, the situation was bad. Really bad. Japan controlled most of the region. They held New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and were threatening Australia itself. American and Australian forces were desperately trying to hold on to Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea. If Port Moresby fell, Australia would be directly threatened. The air forces Kenney inherited were in terrible shape. Not enough planes. The planes they had were old or damaged. Maintenance was poor because of lack of parts. Morale was low because they'd been losing for months. Pilots were exhausted. Ground crews were working with inadequate equipment in jungle conditions. Kenney immediately started fixing problems. He replaced commanders who weren't performing. He reorganized maintenance operations. He scrounged for parts and equipment from everywhere he could. He visited every airfield personally to see conditions and talk to the men. He listened to what pilots and crew chiefs told him about what they needed. Within weeks, the Air Force started improving. More planes were operational. Maintenance got better. But Kenney knew equipment wasn't enough. He needed better tactics. The Japanese were still winning most air battles because their planes, especially the Zero fighter, were superior to what America had in the theater. Kenney studied the problem. American planes couldn't turn as tightly as Japanese planes. They couldn't climb as fast. In traditional dogfighting, the Japanese had the advantage. So Kenney told his pilots to stop dogfighting. Instead, use American advantages. American planes were tougher and could dive faster. So attack from above, dive through the enemy formation, and don't try to turn and fight. Hit and run. He also developed new tactics for attacking Japanese shipping. This would become crucial. Japan's forces in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands depended completely on supplies shipped from their main bases. If Kenney could sink those supply ships, Japanese forces would starve. They'd run out of ammunition. They'd be unable to fight effectively. Kenney experimented with low-level bombing attacks. Flying planes just above the water to drop bombs on ships. This was incredibly dangerous. The planes had to fly through intense anti-aircraft fire. But it was more accurate than high-altitude bombing. And accuracy mattered when you had limited numbers of planes and bombs. By early 1943, Kenney's Air Force was starting to win. They were shooting down more Japanese planes. They were sinking Japanese ships. They were disrupting Japanese operations. MacArthur was impressed. He gave Kenney more authority and more resources. And then came the opportunity that would define Kenney's command. Intelligence reported that a large Japanese convoy was being assembled to reinforce their garrison at La on the northern coast of New Guinea. Multiple transports carrying thousands of troops. Escorted by destroyers. If that convoy got through, Japanese forces at La would be strengthened significantly. It would make MacArthur's planned operations much harder. Kenney saw this convoy as a target. If he could destroy it at sea, he'd eliminate thousands of Japanese troops without having to fight them on land. It would be a devastating blow to Japanese operations in New Guinea. And it would prove the value of air power in a way that even skeptics couldn't ignore. Kenney started planning what would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese convoy left Rabaul, their main base, on March 1, 1943. 8 transports carrying about 7,000 troops. 8 destroyers as escorts. The plan was to sail across the Bismarck Sea to La, unload the troops and supplies, and return to Rabaul. The Japanese expected American air attacks. They always faced air attacks when moving ships in daylight. But they thought their destroyer escorts and air cover would be enough protection. Kenney had been tracking the convoy through intelligence reports. He knew it was coming. He'd been preparing his forces for days. He assembled every bomber he could get. B-17 Flying Fortresses. B-25 Mitchell bombers. A-20 attack bombers. Australian Beaufighters. Everything that could carry bombs or torpedoes. The attack began on March 2nd. B-17 struck first from high altitude. They scored some hits but most bombs missed. High-altitude bombing of moving ships was always difficult. The Japanese convoy kept moving, their destroyers putting up heavy anti-aircraft fire. Then Kenney's medium bombers came in. B-25s and A-20s attacking at low level. This was the tactic Kenney had developed. The planes came in just above the waves, so low that the Japanese couldn't depress their anti-aircraft guns enough to hit them. The bombers released their bombs to skip across the water into the sides of the ships. Like skipping stones, but with 500-pound bombs. The tactic worked devastatingly well. Ships were hit repeatedly. Explosions tore through hulls. Fires started. Ships began to sink. The Japanese convoy was in chaos. Destroyers tried to maneuver to protect the transports, but there were too many attacking planes coming from too many directions. American fighters strafed the ship's decks to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then more bombers came in. Wave after wave. The attacks continued all day on March 2nd and into March 3rd. By the time it was over, all 8 Japanese transports had been sunk. 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sunk. The rest limped back to Rabaul heavily damaged. It was a complete victory. One of the most one-sided naval air battles of the entire war. The Japanese lost almost their entire convoy. About 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned. The survivors were scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, clinging to wreckage, floating in life jackets, trying to stay alive in shark-infested waters. And this is where George Kenney faced his moral crisis. After the battle, Kenney's pilots reported that there were thousands of Japanese in the water. Many were clinging to debris. Some had reached small islands. Some were in lifeboats. They were helpless. Unable to fight. Just trying to survive. Some of Kenney's pilots asked for permission to strafe the survivors. To fly low and machine gun the men in the water. The argument was military necessity. These weren't just sailors. They were soldiers being transported to reinforce La. If they survived and were rescued by Japanese ships, they'd eventually fight against American forces on land. Killing them now would prevent American casualties later. This argument made logical sense from a purely military standpoint. Every Japanese soldier killed in the water was one less enemy to fight later. Some of Kenney's officers supported the idea. They pointed out that this was total war. That the Japanese had committed countless atrocities. That mercy was a luxury America couldn't afford. Kenney listened to these arguments. And then he said no. Absolutely not. No strafing of survivors in the water. Any pilot who did so would face court-martial. This was a direct order from the commanding general. His staff was confused. Why? These were enemy soldiers. This was war. Why show mercy to people who wouldn't show mercy to Americans? Kenney's answer revealed his character. He said that American forces would not commit war crimes. That shooting helpless people in the water was murder, not combat. That there's a difference between killing enemy soldiers who are fighting and killing helpless survivors who can't fight back. That America was supposed to be better than that. But Kenney went further. He ordered rescue operations for the Japanese survivors. Not to capture them, though that would happen for some. But to make sure that Japanese rescue ships could reach the survivors without being attacked. Kenney declared the waters where the battle had happened a temporary safe zone for rescue operations. This decision shocked everyone. Kenney was deliberately allowing enemy forces to rescue enemy soldiers. Soldiers who might fight against Americans in future battles. It seemed crazy. It seemed like Kenney was prioritizing some abstract moral principle over American lives. But Kenney had his reasons. And they were more complex than simple mercy. First, Kenney understood international law. The rules of war were clear. You don't kill helpless survivors. You don't shoot people in lifeboats or floating in the water. These rules existed for good reasons. If everyone ignored them, war would become even more brutal. And importantly, if American forces violated these rules, it would give Japan justification to treat American prisoners even worse than they already were. Second, Kenney was thinking about the future. World War II wouldn't last forever. Eventually, there would be peace. America would have to interact with Japan again. Building a reputation for honor in combat would matter. If America became known for war crimes, it would poison relationships for generations. Third, Kenney believed in what America represented. He'd spent his career in uniform defending American values. One of those values was that America fought honorably. That American forces didn't massacre helpless people. Kenney wasn't going to abandon that value just because it was convenient. His decision wasn't popular. Some pilots ignored the order and strafed survivors anyway. When Kenney found out, he was furious. He threatened to court-martial anyone who did it again. The strafing stopped. Japanese rescue ships did come and picked up about 2,800 survivors from the convoy. About 2,800 soldiers who would eventually return to combat. Kenney's critics said this proved his decision was wrong. Those rescued soldiers would kill Americans later. But something unexpected happened. Word of Kenney's order spread. Japanese forces heard about it. They heard that an American general had forbidden his troops from shooting helpless Japanese survivors. That he'd allowed rescue operations. In a war filled with atrocities on both sides, this act of mercy stood out. Some Japanese officers began treating American prisoners slightly better. Not dramatically. Japanese POW camps remained brutal. But there were individual cases where Japanese officers cited Kenney's action as proof that honorable conduct was still possible even in total war. More importantly, Kenney's decision affected his own forces. His pilots and crew saw that their commander had principles. That he wouldn't ask them to do things that violated the laws of war. This built trust. Soldiers fight better when they trust their commanders. When they believe their commanders won't waste their lives or ask them to do immoral things. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became one of the most studied air-naval battles of World War II. Military analysts looked at Kenney's tactics. The low-level skip bombing. The coordination between different types of aircraft. The use of fighters to suppress anti-aircraft fire. All of it became part of Air Force doctrine. But the most important lesson wasn't tactical. It was about command. About the decisions leaders make when nobody's watching. When there's no clear right answer. When military necessity conflicts with moral principles. Kenney could have allowed the strafing. Nobody would have court-martialed him. In the context of World War II, with all its horrors, shooting survivors from a military convoy would have been a minor incident. It might not even have made the newspapers. The military certainly wouldn't have punished Kenney for it. But Kenney knew he'd have to live with that decision. He'd have to look at himself in the mirror. He'd have to know that he'd ordered his men to commit murder. Because that's what it would have been. Not combat. Murder. Years later, after the war, Kenney was asked about his decision at the Bismarck Sea. Interviewers wanted to know if he regretted it. If he thought about the American soldiers who might have been killed by the Japanese troops he'd allowed to be rescued. Kenney's answer was straightforward. He said he'd made the right decision. That war doesn't require abandoning humanity. That being a warrior doesn't mean being a murderer. That America could win without becoming like its enemies. He also pointed out something that critics often missed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea achieved its objective completely. The Japanese convoy was destroyed. The reinforcements never reached La. Japanese operations in New Guinea were crippled. The mission was a total success. The fact that some survivors were rescued didn't change that outcome. The battle also proved the value of air power in a way that convinced even skeptics. MacArthur saw what Kenney's air forces could do. From that point forward, MacArthur gave Kenney almost complete freedom to plan and execute air operations. The partnership between MacArthur and Kenney became one of the most effective command relationships in the Pacific War. Kenney went on to command Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific for the rest of the war. His forces supported MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. They destroyed Japanese shipping. They established air superiority over Japanese-held territory. They supported amphibious landings. They bombed Japanese bases into rubble. By the end of the war, Kenney's air forces had essentially isolated Japanese ground forces in the Southwest Pacific. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, Japanese garrisons withered. Many were simply bypassed and left to starve. Kenney's strategy of destroying Japanese logistics proved more effective than trying to kill every Japanese soldier in direct combat. The principles Kenney demonstrated at the Bismarck Sea carried through his entire command. He fought hard. He was aggressive. He took risks. But he maintained standards. He didn't allow his forces to commit atrocities. He built a reputation for being a tough but honorable opponent. After the war ended, Kenney was one of the architects of the independent United States Air Force. When the Air Force split from the Army in 1947, Kenney was one of the senior leaders who shaped the new service. He helped establish the culture and values that would define the Air Force for generations. George Kenney's story matters because it shows that winning and honor aren't opposites. You don't have to become a monster to defeat monsters. You can fight hard and still maintain principles. You can be ruthlessly effective and still be a decent human being. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a devastating victory. Kenney's forces destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. They killed thousands of enemy soldiers. They crippled Japanese operations in New Guinea. By any military measure, it was a success. And Kenney achieved that success while still refusing to cross moral lines. Compare this to some other commanders in World War II. Commanders who authorized or allowed war crimes. Who justified atrocities as military necessity. Some of them won battles too. But their victories were tainted. Their reputations were destroyed. And their actions didn't actually help win the war any faster. Kenney proved that you could be both effective and ethical. That principles weren't weakness. That honor in combat wasn't just romantic nonsense from an earlier age. Even in total war, even in the Pacific where both sides regularly committed atrocities, it was possible to fight with honor. The decision at Bismarck Sea also showed something important about leadership. Real leadership isn't about always making the popular decision. It's about making the right decision even when it's unpopular. Even when your own people are pushing you to do something wrong. Kenney's pilots wanted permission to strafe survivors. Some of his staff supported it. The easy thing would have been to say yes. Or to just look the other way and let it happen without an explicit order. Nobody would have blamed Kenney. It was war. Things happen. But Kenney didn't take the easy path. He made a clear decision and enforced it. He was willing to be unpopular with his own forces to maintain a standard he believed in. That's leadership. Not the kind that gets you cheered in the moment. But the kind that builds lasting respect and trust. The soldiers who served under Kenney understood this eventually, even if they didn't at first. They understood that their commander wasn't going to ask them to do things that would haunt them later. That he would push them hard in combat but wouldn't make them into war criminals. That mattered. It built unit cohesion and morale in ways that pure aggressiveness never could. Kenney's career after the war also validated his approach. He was respected by everyone. Promoted to 4-star general. Given important commands. Asked to help shape the new Air Force. He wasn't haunted by war crimes investigations or moral questions about his conduct. He could look back on his service with pride. Compare that to commanders who took the other path. Who allowed or encouraged atrocities. Some of them faced war crimes trials after the war. Some killed themselves. Some lived with guilt and shame. Their military successes were overshadowed by the crimes they'd committed or allowed. Kenney didn't have to deal with any of that. His conscience was clear. He'd fought hard. He'd won victories. He'd helped defeat Japan. And he'd done it without abandoning his principles. The lesson of the Bismarck Sea goes beyond World War II. It applies to every war and every military force. The temptation to abandon rules and principles in pursuit of victory is always there. There's always someone arguing that the ends justify the means. That you have to fight dirty to win. That honor is a luxury you can't afford. Kenney proved those arguments wrong. You can win while maintaining honor. You can be ruthlessly effective while respecting laws of war. You can kill your enemies in combat without murdering helpless survivors. These aren't contradictions. They're different aspects of the same thing, being a professional warrior rather than a thug with a uniform. Modern militaries still struggle with these questions. In every conflict, commanders face situations where military necessity seems to conflict with moral principles. Where the easy answer is to violate rules and deal with consequences later. Where doing the right thing seems to cost lives or opportunities. Kenney's example shows how to handle these situations. You make the decision that you can live with afterward. You maintain standards even when it's hard. You understand that reputation and honor matter not just for their own sake, but because they affect how you fight and how effective you are in the long run. The pilots and soldiers who served under Kenney in the Pacific learned these lessons. Many of them went on to be leaders themselves in later wars. Korea. Vietnam. They carried forward the example Kenney had set. That being a warrior didn't mean being a barbarian. That effectiveness and ethics could coexist. George Kenney died in 1977 at the age of 88. He'd lived long enough to see the Air Force he helped create become the most powerful Air Force in the world. He'd seen his tactics become standard doctrine. He'd seen his principles validated over and over. His obituaries focused on his tactical innovations and his victories. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was always mentioned as his greatest achievement. But the obituaries often missed the most important part of that battle. Not the tactical victory. Not the ships sunk or enemies killed. But the decision Kenney made about how to achieve that victory. That decision showed what kind of man George Kenney was. What kind of commander. What kind of American. He was someone who understood that how you win matters as much as whether you win. That maintaining your principles in the hardest moments defines who you are. That being a warrior means more than just being good at killing. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea destroyed a Japanese convoy and saved American lives by preventing those reinforcements from reaching La. But it did something more. It proved that America could fight a brutal war without becoming brutal itself. That American forces could be effective while still maintaining the values America claimed to represent. That's George Kenney's real legacy. Not just the battles won or the tactics developed, but the example set. The proof that honor and victory aren't opposites. That you can destroy your enemies while still respecting the rules that separate civilization from barbarism. In a war filled with atrocities, in a theater where both sides regularly committed war crimes, one American general drew a line. He said no. He made his forces fight honorably. And he proved that fighting honorably didn't mean fighting less effectively. It meant fighting better. With clear conscience. With the respect of your enemies and the trust of your troops. That's the lesson of the Bismarck Sea. That's the lesson of George Kenney. And it's a lesson every generation of warriors needs to learn again. Watch the next video for another story about honor in the worst war in history.